I would like to begin the class by speaking for a brief while about the relationship between Tennyson and Wordsworth. The relationship between Lord Tennyson and William Wordsworth was a rather complex one. On the one hand, Tennyson was a passionate admirer of the poetry of Wordsworth, who declared, Tennyson declared, that at his best, Wordsworth is the greatest English poet after Milton. After Milton. On the other hand, Tennyson was not blind to what he perceived as the weaknesses of the poetry of Wordsworth. For example, he complained that some of Wordsworth's poems were too long. A complaint frequently received from students who have to study in Memoriam A.H.H regarding the Tennyson poem. Tennyson observed that when inspiration fails him, Wordsworth's literary instincts are very poor, and that it cannot be denied that Wordsworth has written pages and pages of utterly unreadable verse. However, Tennyson was a very diligent student of Wordsworth, who read Wordsworth with utmost care and absorbed all that he had to absorb from Wordsworth. We can find traces of the influence of Wordsworth on the poetry of Lord Tennyson, including In Memoriam A.H.H. Perhaps the single most important result of the influence of Wordsworth on Tennyson is that in Memoriam A.H.H. we come across a sustained effort to reach the permanent through the transient. This was one of Wordsworth's favorite themes. The immortal in the mortal, the infinite in the finite, the divine in the mundane. We can, in Memoriam A.H.H, find an effort to search for the permanent in the transient. Similarly, the influence of Wordsworth on Tennyson is visible in Memoriam A.H.H, in the focus on nature, in the focus on the English country life, in the focus on the countryside, the rural England, the villages of England, the focus on the geography of England, the rivers of England. It may not be out of place to add that when Tennyson succeeded Wordsworth as the poet laureate, he made a touching expression of gratitude. Tennyson made a touching expression of gratitude to his predecessor. And there is no doubt that Wordsworth played a key role in shaping Tennyson As poet, as philosopher, as Victorian cultural icon. Canto 81. The poet says that his friendship with Hallam was perfect. However, it was short lived. He wishes that he could have said that he was able to enjoy the full fruits of friendship here on earth. There was nothing more in terms of quality that could be added to the friendship between Tennyson and Hallam. But the glaring fact remains that the friendship was an extremely brief one. The poet had hoped for a richer store of love resulting from a more prolonged friendship, but Hallam is now dead, and there can be no end to the grief of the poet. Death gives a sweet reply to this complaint of the poet. Death explains that the friendship between Tennyson and Hallam matured too soon. It ripened too soon. It perfected itself too soon. There was no scope for further development in that friendship. The conclusion is that the death of Hallam was a sort of natural consequence of this exceptional friendship ripening, maturing, perfecting itself too soon. 282. The poet does not blame death for bringing about changes on the body of Hallam. The decay of the body cannot shatter the poet's faith in the immortality of the soul. The spirit walks through a succession of stages. The spirit leaves the body behind, and the poet has no quarrel with death on account of this. The poet has no quarrel with death because death has taken Hallam away from this earth. This is because the poet knows that the qualities of Hallam, the good qualities of Hallam, have been transported to some other world. The good qualities of Hallam are being put to better use in that world. Then what is the quarrel of the poet with death? The poet is angry with death because death has separated Tennyson and Hallam forever. The distance between the poet and his friend is infinite. This distance is caused by death. And that is the reason for the poet being angry with death. Canto 83. There is delay in the arrival of spring. The poet wonders why spring has not arrived yet. The poet blames the new year for delaying the advent of spring. The poet wants to know why spring has not come so far. Why is it that even in April, even on an April afternoon, the sky is clouded? The poet wants spring to come. The poet wants the various flowers associated with spring to bloom. This is because the poet is carrying a great burden of sorrow, an immense burden of sorrow. And the delay in the arrival of spring prolongs the grief of the poet. The sorrow of the poet will melt only with the arrival of spring. The sorrow is prepared to melt. The sorrow of grief experienced by the poet is ready to melt. But for that, spring has to come. This canto, which refers to the month of April and the flowers of spring, remind me of the very famous opening lines of the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales of Geoffrey Chaucer. I quote, "When that April with his showers sooty the droghte of March hath burst to the roote." Unquote. In Canto 84, the poet contemplates, sitting all alone, the possibilities that would have opened up had Hallam lived a fuller life. Hallam was a crescent when he breathed his last. What would have happened if the crescent had grown into a full moon? Hallam would have married Emily, the poet's sister. They were very much in love with each other, and they were in fact engaged to be married. Children would have been born to Hallam and Emily, and these children would call Tennyson uncle, because in fact he is their uncle. He is Emily's brother, and thus uncle to the children of Emily and Hallam. Hallam would have engaged himself in scholarly conversation with the poet. There would have been pleasant discourses between the two. Hallam would have achieved success, won praises. With the passage of time, he would have climbed the pinnacle of success. Hallam would have lived a full life, with its share of success and prosperity. And then Hallam's soul would have left this earth after living a full life on this earth. The poet's soul also would have left this earth, and he that died in Holy Land, and he that died in Holy Land would reach us out the shining hand and take us as a single soul. Jesus Christ, Son of God and God the Son, would reach out and lift up the souls of Hallam and Tennyson as if they were a single soul. The poet thus makes it clear that there was a very bonded relationship between Hallam and himself, that though they were two bodies, they were in fact one soul. In the last stanza, the poet wakes up from his bout of fancy and starts feeling the old bitterness regarding the death of Hallam, the painful sorrow generated by the death of Hallam. Canto 84 invites comparison with the highly anthologized essay of Charles Lamb, Dream Children, a Reverie. In Dream Children, a Reverie, the speaker indulges in a fantasy. He goes through a storytelling session with his children, Alice and John. But by the time the essay ends, we realize that the children are non existent. The children are only the figment of the imagination of the writer. Because the woman Charles Lamb quoted married another man, and she indeed had children. But they do not call Lamb father, they call the other man father. Both Canto 84 and Dream Children a Reverie are about children who are never born. We now come to a very important canto, Canto 85. The canto is important for a number of reasons. The first of these is that the opening stanza of the canto contains two of the most popular, two of the most famous, two of the most oft quoted lines of Lord Tennyson. "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." I repeat, "'tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." The canto is important because in the canto we are introduced to a person called Edmund Law Lushington. Edmund Law Lushington. Edmund Law Lushington was a classical scholar who ultimately became professor of Greek at the University of Glasgow. He was a close friend of the poet, and he became part of the Tennyson family when he married Tennyson's younger sister, the poet's younger sister, Cecilia, better known as Cecily. I don't have to remind you that Arthur Henry Hallam had been engaged to Tennyson's younger sister, the poet's younger sister, Emilia, better known as Emily, when he breathed his last. Lushington is a sort of substitute for Hallam. I don't think whether I'm using the right word. No human being can be a real substitute for another human being, but still, Hallam breathed his last. Hallam died. The poet was shattered. And now the poet accepts a new friend who, to some extent at least, occupies the space vacated by Hallam, and that is Lushington. Let us take a more close look at the canto. As I've already pointed out, the opening stanza of Canto 85 contains the famous lines of Tennyson: "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." A friend asks the poet what kind of life he leads. The friend is Edmund Law Lushington, the classical scholar who later became professor of Greek at the University of Glasgow, and who became the brother-in-law of the poet by marrying Cecily or Cecilia, the poet's younger sister. Lushington is praised as true in word and tried in deed in the second stanza, and thus the ground is prepared for the rest of the canto. Poet narrates the various stages through which Hallam is translated in his spiritual journey. The gates of the gates of heaven welcome Hallam, receive Hallam. Tennyson says that Hallam led a rich life, intellectually and spiritually, blessed by the nine muses, the nine goddesses of learning in Greek, in classical mythology. Poet's love for Hallam, the poet's sorrow over Hallam's death has passed through various stages, and the poet decides that he will no more mourn the death of Hallam. Instead, he will look forward for a friend in future. The seasons, the year, summer, spring, and autumn, remind him of Hallam, and he is always reminded of his association. The poet is always reminded of his association with his friend, who is no more. But the poet is in need of a friend for the years to come. The poet craves for the spirit of his friend to make the poet's soul free from the suffering of human nature. He wants to know if Hallam can feel the sadness of his soul. Hallam's soul replies that he is watching Tennyson from heaven. Hallam is watching Tennyson from heaven, from the quiet shore of heaven. The poet's spirit can reach Hallam's spirit, but they cannot communicate with each other. The spirit of Hallam explains that Hallam can understand the final happiness of the next life. The dead ones wish to communicate with the living, but they are unable to do so. The poet asks whether Hallam does not feel some sympathy for the poet who is in pain, some painless sympathy for the poet who is in pain. The soul of Hallam tells Tennyson that it is difficult for Tennyson to understand the deep mystery of life after death. The soul, speaking from beyond the grave, seems to exhort the poet to take a living friend for himself, to accept a new friend who can speak to him in human speech, which he, which Hallam, being dead, cannot do. Thus, Tennyson holds commerce with the dead, interacts with the dead. The poet consoles himself with the thought that his separation from Hallam is not permanent, and that he shall one day experience a meeting with Hallam in some other world. In full faith that Tennyson shall once again be united with Hallam in some other world, and in obedience to the desire of Hallam, to the suggestion of Hallam, to the advice of Hallam, conveyed to Tennyson from beyond the grave, the poet desires to take another friend here on earth. The friend is Edmund Law Lushington, as I have already observed. This friend on earth shall have such remains of his love as he can bestow. This friend on earth shall have such remains of his widowed love as he can bestow. It is like somewhat like your widow marrying again. What she gives her second husband is the remains, is what remains of the love she had given her first husband. The primrose of spring is Hallam, who is in heaven, and the primrose of autumn is Lushington, who is very much on this earth. This is a very important canto because it indicates a movement from death to life, from decay and degeneration to revival, from sorrow to joy, which is muted because it refuses to reject the background of sorrow, the backdrop of sorrow, from Hallam to Lushington. I would like to point out that Hallam and Lushington had a lot in common with each other. They were passionate students of literature. They were very much academically oriented. They were perfect gentlemen. They were well behaved. They had high moral fiber. Both ended up becoming members of the Tennyson family, of course. Hallam could not marry Emily because though he was engaged to Emily, he died before he could marry her. But Lushington married Cecily, and I think Lushington is a perfect replacement, if there can be a replacement, for Hallam in the life of Tennyson, in the life of Tennyson as a man, and also in the life of Tennyson as a poet. It is said that when he received the news of the untimely death of Hallam, William Gladstone, the Liberal politician, 4 times Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, exclaimed, "When shall I see his like?" I repeat, when shall I see his like? Because there could be nobody like Hallam. Hallam was a unique personage, and nobody could take his place. But we find in Memoriam A.H.H the space vacated by Hallam, the space in the life of Tennyson vacated by Hallam, the space in the life of Tennyson rendered empty as a result of the departure of Hallam from this world, as a result of the untimely demise of Hallam, being occupied by Tennyson's new friend, Lushington, Edmund Law Lushington. Let us take a close look, or at least a rather close look, at Canto 86. The poet's mental state moves from doubt and thought of death towards peace and hope of renewed life. You must remember that the backdrop for this canto is the new friendship that the poet has established with Lushington, with Edmund Lushington. The fact that the space vacated by Hallam as a result of his untimely death, the space in the life of Tennyson, is now in the process of being occupied by Lushington. The poet invokes the ambrosial air of the evening. The sweet after shower breeze is winnowing the whole atmosphere. The poet wants thoughts of death and doubt to be blown away, like clouds from the sky, in the face of his new friendship with Edmund Lushington. The poet wants the entire region to be freed from thoughts of death and doubt. He wishes the order of his new friendship to spread far and wide, to cover the entire atmosphere. In Canto 87, we find Tennyson visiting Cambridge, the locale of his friendship with Hallam. It is a visit tinged with nostalgia. He visits the college rooms, the chapels. He is reminded of the competitions, the boating competitions on the River Thames. The poet goes to the room which had once been occupied by Hallam and which is now occupied by someone else. It is now the venue of a drinking party. The buildings, the rooms, the colleges, the chapels, the physical objects, the structures remain the same, but the poet feels that the atmosphere has completely changed. On the door of the room occupied by Hallam is not the name of Hallam, but the name of another person. The boys taking part in the boisterous drinking party throw the glass on the floor, crash the glass on the floor, and beat the floor. When Hallam resided in the room, debates were held, highly intellectual debates were held on subjects of on subjects in philosophy, economics, commerce, and political science. But no such thing can be met with now. During the debates, the participants often fail to speak with force, with relevance, with conviction. All the participants except one, and that one person was Hallam. The participants in the debates eagerly waited for the words that flowed out of the mouth of Hallam. When he spoke with authority. He spoke with conviction. He was highly informed. He was always correct. He had forceful arguments at his command. It even appeared that he was divinely inspired, and his face glowed with some divine light. His face, in fact, had a divinely handsome appearance, reminding one of the Italian painter Michelangelo. It is very significant that the poet works out the comparison between the great painter of the High Renaissance, Michelangelo, and Hallam. Michelangelo is looked upon as the archetypal Renaissance man. He was a great painter. In fact, some art critics believe that he was the greatest painter the world has ever seen. But he was no mere painter. He was also an architect, a sculptor, a poet, a scholar, a philosopher. As I said, he was the archetypal Renaissance man. And there is a subtext in this canto that if Hallam had lived longer, if Hallam had lived a full life, he would have evolved into a Renaissance man himself. Canto 88 is a short canto, but a beautiful canto. It opens with the words, wild bird. The wild bird is generally identified by critics with the nightingale. And you must remember that the nightingale is one of the favorite birds of English poets. The nightingale sings a song which is simultaneously a song of sorrow and a song of joy. The song of the nightingale is beautiful and it brings a sense of Eden back. The poet wonders how the nightingale is able to sing such a beautiful song, which is at the same time a song of joy and a song of grief. The poet is also in a similar state. He would very much like to sing a sad song, but he does not have full control over his creative powers. He is unable to keep his joy and his sorrow in watertight compartments. His joy and his sorrow interpenetrate each other. The poet sings in such a way that joy and sorrow are intermingled in a rather confused manner. In this way, the poet sings like the nightingale. It is highly improbable for Tennyson not to have been aware of the mythological background of the nightingale. In classical mythology, Philomela is raped and mutilated by her sister's husband Tereus, and Philomela becomes the nightingale. Similarly, it is highly unlikely that Tennyson was unaware of the profound symbolism of the nightingale. In Western literature, the nightingale has, over the centuries, symbolized nature, creativity, the poet's art, and all these symbolisms are at least partially applicable to the wild bird in the context of this canto. Canto 89 is a lovely canto drenched in nostalgia. It is set in Somersby, the village of Somersby is an extremely beautiful English village, remembered now as the birthplace of Tennyson, as the place where Tennyson spent his early years, where Tennyson grew up. The church in Somersby, St. Margaret's Church, is important for students of Tennyson because it was in this church that little Tennyson was baptized. Needless to say, Alfred Tennyson's father, was rector at St. Margaret's Church, Somersby. In Canto 89, the poet recalls the natural beauty, the scenic beauty of Somersby, the beautiful nature as visible in the village of Somersby around their cottage. Hallam was a frequent visitor to Somersby. The sycamore tree is mentioned, the towering sycamore. The sycamore is a large Eurasian maple tree which stands in the grounds of the church and the rector's cottage. Hallam loved to come to Somersby to escape from city life. Hallam was a nature lover. He found great joy in absorbing the beauty of nature, and while at Somersby, he used to read the Tuscan poets. The Tuscan poets are the great Italian poets of the Renaissance, and the Tuscan poets include Dante and Petrarch. The Socratic dream is mentioned, or threaded some Socratic dream. Socrates, the first great philosopher of the Western world. Of course, the first great philosopher is frequently mentioned as Plato, but it was Socrates who trained Plato, who taught Plato, though he did not write himself. Socrates used to say that the unexamined life is a life not worth living. I repeat, the unexamined life is not a life worth living. So, what the poet tries to convey through the passage is that Hallam and Tennyson used to engage themselves in debates, in discussions regarding the various facets of life. In Somersby, in the hamlet of Somersby, the visitors merged their identities into one. There was so much cohesion in the group. There was so much of bonding, that they became one, and they used to go for long walks and return before the planet Venus set. The canto reveals how much of a nature poet, how much of a gifted nature poet Tennyson is, and also how much a master of nostalgia Tennyson is. This is a potent combination. Nature and nostalgia, the themes of nature and nostalgia interpenetrating each other. And that precisely is what we come across in this canto. Canto 90 is a very interesting canto. It deals with the complex relationship between the dead and the living. What would happen if the dead return to the world of the living? There are some who believe that if the dead come back to life, they will find a cold welcome. They will receive a cold welcome from their family. The poet asserts that whoever advocates this cynicism has never tasted love at its highest. The poet decides to amplify on what he has said, perhaps also modify what he has said. The poet admits that if the father returns to life, he may probably find that his wife has remarried and that his son is unwilling to give up his estate even for a day. You must remember that this estate had been the estate of the father. Now it has been inherited by the son. And if the father returns to life, the son may not be willing to hand over the estate to his father even for a day. There would be confusion, worse than death. Confusion which might shake the pillars of domestic peace. Those who externally mourn the death of a man may not welcome him sincerely if he comes back to life. Hence, there may be some truth in the assertion, in the claim that if the dead come back to life, they are bound to receive a cold welcome. Be that as it may, that is the point. Yet, be that as it may, the poet wishes for his friend's return to life. The poet desires that Hallam should return to life. And in this longing, the poet is unable to find a single argument, a single thought that goes against this desire. Thus, in Canto 90, the poet works out a brilliant contrast between his relationship with Hallam on the one hand and human relationships in general on the other, and demonstrates convincingly that the poet's relationship with Hallam was extremely pure, was noble, was even divine, unlike the relationships that human beings have with one another in general.